For me, the global world felt like a room with glass walls. Like you could see movement inside, and you could sense that something important was happening there, but you couldn't hear the conversation, and you didn't know how to open the door either.
Welcome back to the Education Vanguard podcast. My name is Justin Hardman, and I'm very happy to be joined today. I'm in Hong Kong with Jiayuan Tian, who is a Master of International Affairs candidate at Columbia University. So he's joining me late in the evening, his time. He's there concentrating in urban and social policy. He recently graduated from Minerva University, which is a really interesting online around the world undergraduate program, which we'll talk a little bit about, with a double major in arts and humanities and social sciences. But he's also up to a lot of other stuff as well, which we'll dive into, including being the co-founder of OneXplore, which is a social enterprise bridging information gaps in international education, and the founder of a youth storytelling forum with over 800 youth profiles. He focuses on expanding equitable access to global learning and civic participation, which I think are things that we desperately need in the world today. He's also served as a super shaper with the World Economic Forum. So for a person that's young, just doing his graduate degrees, he's achieved a lot already. And I'm very happy to be diving into a conversation with him today. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Justin. Hi, everyone. My name is Jiayuan Tian, and I'm a social entrepreneur and graduate student in public policy. And thank you so much again for inviting me to this podcast to share some of my past journeys and reflections.
Fantastic. I wonder if we just kick off by, could you just sort of just introduce yourself a little bit more and then maybe talk specifically about before you even got into university and did your Minerva, what do you think shaped your curiosity about global learning and international experiences? So where does this passion come from?
Absolutely. For me, I think my curiosity about global learning didn't come from feeling globally connected. Instead, it came from feeling global excluded. So for me, growing up in southern China, the world beyond national borders existed mostly for me as an abstraction, I would say. We learn about globalization in the textbooks, but never as something we might personally enter in the future. And we were encouraged to work hard, to complete, to aim for the excellence. But actually, no one explained how international opportunities actually worked or who they were meant for. So for me, the global world felt like a room with glass walls. Like you could see movement inside, and you could sense that something important was happening there, but you couldn't hear the conversation, and you didn't know how to open the door either. So I didn't yet have the language to call this information asymmetry, which is pretty important, but I felt it pretty vividly. I sensed that the access wasn't only about talent or effort, it was about, I would say, the invisible rules, about knowing where to look, what to ask, and also whom to trust with. And that gap really quietly shaped my curiosity. I didn't just want to go abroad. Instead, I want to understand how the global learning was structured and also why it felt so unevenly distributed for the youth like me. Yeah.
That's great. And I wonder if you talk a little bit more about just your perceptions of education in China. You grew up, as you say, in southern China. And I think that there's, it's obviously, if you're not in the international stream, there's a very high stakes educational system. And, what's your perception of that in terms of what success in that system looks like relative to what you think education should be?
Yeah, I would say the definition of success, such message was pretty consistent and also really questioned for me as I grew up in mainland China. So for us, success always meant ranking well, entering a pretty prestigious university, and also choosing a safe and respectable major and progressing along a clearly defined track. So education, I would say, was framed as a ladder and deviation was treated as risk. So the goal was not exploitation, but optimization. And there was also pretty little space for the uncertainty or the nonlinear growth. Like curiosity was encouraged only when it could be converted into some sort of achievements. And failure was not framed as the feedback, but as a permanent stain. Global education, when mentioned, was often associated with some elite families or exceptional circumstances, not as something that the ordinary students could have the access to in a realistic way. So over time, I would say many of us internalize the idea that worth is proven through efficiency, and that hesitation means falling behind out of the major group. And that mindset really produces the high-performing students, but it also produces the quiet anxiety. For me, it took several years to recognize how deeply that narrative shaped my relationship with learning and also how much unlearning would be required later. And I think after I went to the undergraduate school Minerva, something has changed. Yeah.
That's great. Could you talk a bit more about Minerva for the audience that may be unfamiliar with it? I mean, when you first reached out, I was really keen to talk to you because of this experience. I think it's a really pioneering way of learning, and I think we have a lot to learn from it. So yeah, so you could talk some more about what is Minerva and why you chose it and how it works.
Absolutely. I would say in one sentence, Minerva, it fundamentally disrupted how I understood education. So for those people who are unfamiliar with it, Minerva University is a really highly selective and also global undergraduate institution founded on a radically different model of higher education. There is no traditional or real campus for us. There's no large lecture halls and no fixed geography. Instead, students live and study together in a new global city each semester, with all courses taught in small, fully interactive seminars, which focused mainly on the critical thinking, problem solving, and also real world application to cultivate students as global citizens. And during my undergraduate 4 years, I studied across cities, including San Francisco, Seoul, Berlin, London, Buenos Aires, Beijing, Taipei, and Hyderabad. And my classrooms quite literally moved as the world changed around me. What that meant in practice was that learning was never abstract. Political theory, economics, sociology, and even ethics were constantly tested against the lived realities outside the classroom window. And also, all of the courses are discussion based, which are kept at small sizes and also centered on applying the concepts. Rather than memorizing the content, there's no exam for us. So you are asked again and again to compare the different systems to ask why the same policy works in one context and fails in another. And also to reflect on how the power, history, and culture shape outcomes. So learning becomes really competitive and also comparative by design through our curriculum. But I would say what stayed with me most was the contradiction embedded in this undergraduate experience. On one hand, Minerva embodies a really powerful ideal of global citizenship. It pushes students to think beyond the national borders, to engage deeply with the difference, and also to see the world as interconnected with each other. And on the other hand, it I would say, quietly assumes access to a set of invisible forms of capital, like near native English fluency, cultural confidence, financial flexibility, and also a comfort with the ambiguity and the constant transition. And as I enter the higher grades, that tension became most visible through place. For example, in Berlin, I studied political institutions shaped by its historical trauma and also collective memory. In Buenos Aires, the capital city of Argentina, I witnessed how the economic instability really constrained young people's choices long before individual effort could matter. And in Seoul, South Korea, I feel the pressure cooker of educational competition compressed in everyday life, ambition, exhaustion, and also silence coexisting in the same spaces. So overall, I would say each city revealed a different face of inequality. And together, they forced me to confront and I would say a really uncomfortable truth that global education often celebrates the diversity in a rhetoric way. But in practice, it filters who gets to practice fully and also who has to work harder just to stay afloat in this field. And that realization didn't decrease the value of my education. I would say instead it sharpened it. And it became one of the core questions that later shaped my work. Not just to like how to globalize the education, but also how to make the global learning become more equitable, legible, and also humane. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are really powerful reflections actually in terms of the privilege piece, right? You know, and even students, I mean, a lot of our community are in international schools, and even if you're not moving around the world and going to global cities, a lot of the students in the schools that are in our community are in very privileged positions. And I even think about my own kids, going to an international school, and there's a lot of affluence around, and I think it is important that the actors in these environments recognize where they're at, and not be ashamed of it, but take what they can from it, and leverage that, right, for a greater good. And I kind of want to dive a little bit into that because I think the experience of Minerva is amazing, obviously, but you said it yourself. It's not, you didn't say it in these words, it's certainly not a scalable educational platform, right? You're not going to have every undergraduate student in the world being able to experience education in this way. But it's also, of course, very powerful, right? In terms of some of the things you've talked about, non-linearity, agency. So I wonder if you could think about what are some ways that students that maybe aren't in this position to be experiencing kind of a global education in the way you did, how can they bring that to their situation? So how can you bring agency as a learner if you're in, the Gaokao, system, or in a traditional educational setting?
I would say at Minerva University, students often enter the international education without the traditional forms of power. Like many of them would come from the exam-centric system, such as where success depends on the rule following, memorization, and also external evaluation, rather than the choice, voice, or the self-direction. And when these students transition into the global education space, I would say they face several structural disadvantages. Firstly, I would say there is an epistemic imbalance. Like global classrooms privilege I would say the Western academic norms, such as discussion-based participation and also confidence in speaking. So students trained under the Gaokao system may be labeled as quiet or passive, not because they lack insight, but I would say because their prior system rewarded the restraint and also accuracy over their spontaneity. And secondly, I think there is also a hidden cultural capital. The international education, I think it assumes the familiarity with the academic English and also informal debate and also self-advocacy. So these expectations, they are rarely taught in a clear way, and also placing first generation or global South students at a disadvantage even when they are academically strong. And thirdly, I think students also have limited institutional power, like curricula, assessment standards, and definition of excellence we just talked about. They are pre-designed, so students rarely shape what counts as the legitimate knowledge or whose experiences are centered. But I think despite all of these constraints, I think learners nowadays can still exercise agency in some meaningful ways. And I would say one form of agency is strategic translation. I noticed that students can translate their strengths from exam systems, such as discipline, pattern recognition, into the new contexts, even in some really innovative education system. For example, at Minerva, this might mean preparing rigorously for discussions and also structuring the arguments in a careful way, and also treating the participation as a skill to be trained rather than a personality trait. And another way I think is reframing the participation, because I believe agency does not only mean speaking the loudest. Students can also ask precise questions, bringing the comparative perspectives from their own non-Western systems, and also introduce cases that challenge their assumed universality. So in doing so, I think they would shift the classroom from the consumption of the global knowledge to its negotiation. And I also think meta learning, like learning how learning itself is structured, is important, because Minerva's focus on the transferable thinking habits, so we call it HC, it really allows students to name, analyze, and also adapt the rules of the academic game. And once these rules are visible, I believe students will gain the leverage, even if they didn't design it. And so finally, I think students can also exercise the narrative agency by articulating how the systems like the Gaokao shape their thinking before, I would say, reposition themselves not as deficient learners, but as products of another different rational system. So this thinking would challenge the deficit-based views of the international students and also expands what counts as their intellectual legitimacy. So overall, I think while students from the exam-driven systems, they often enter the international education without the structural power, those young people, they can still reclaim the agency through translating their prior strengths into something new, to actively reshaping whose knowledge is valued, and to understand how it's constructed through their strategy and voices. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think those are very powerful reflections, and I think so much of education is bound up in culture, right? And it's important for us to everyone, all of the participants in that experience to untangle those things and be quite mindful about it for sure. I wonder if we can pivot to talk a little bit about OneXplore. So you developed that, co-founded that out of your own experiences. Can you talk a bit about what that is, why you created it, and what problem it's solving?
Absolutely. So one explore story is pretty long, like before it existed. So I grew up in a system where the international education really felt distant and also opaque. And when I began navigating the global education myself, from the exam-oriented schooling to Minerva's fully global model, I realized that the biggest barrier wasn't talent or motivation. It was about information asymmetry, like who gets access to real examples, who understands the application logic rather than just requirements, and who knows that there are multiple pathways, not just the most visible or the elite ones. And I had to learn most of this through the trial and error, and also conversations with strangers, and also emotional uncertainty. And I kept thinking, if this thing is hard for someone already inside the system, how impossible must it feel for those outside it? And I would say that question became the seed for me to grow OneXplore. And OneXplore didn't begin as a startup at first. It began with some documentation that I record. I started by collecting stories, not for the success slogans, but for the processes themselves, like how people actually make decision, how like where they hesitated, what they misunderstood about their career path, and what went wrong before something worked. So I interviewed over 500 students, gap year explorers, and scholarship recipients, and also young professionals across different countries and backgrounds. Over time, I would say those stories grew into a living archive. And after that, I noticed a pattern that most platforms focused on the outcomes, and a few of them focused on decision-making literacy. So OneXplore really evolved into a social enterprise with a clear mission to help young people build agency in navigating the international education rather than simply chasing the credentials. And we structure our mission around three pillars as well. The first one is narrative, the real detailed learning journeys that help students have clear understanding about global education. And secondly, access, the curated opportunities, scholarships, programs, and also alternative pathways for them. The final one is the agency. Like we build the mentor-mentee programs to help learners understand why choices matter, not just what choices exist. And I would say what makes OneXplore different is it's shaped by my belief that learning is not linear. So instead of framing gap years, detours, or uncertainty as risks, we frame those concepts as sites of learning. Instead of encouraging blind optimization, we kind of emphasize the reflection and also context. So this perspective comes directly from my own path across the various disciplines in Minerva, Columbia, Peking University, different cities, San Francisco to Berlin, and also sectors from international education organizations to media and also policy spaces, where the adaptability mattered more than the perfect planning. So I would say, in that sense, OneXplore is not just a platform for us, it's an argument that global education should not reward only those who already know its rules, but also for the young people who deserve the transparency and also dignity. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really powerful what you identify there in terms of that, all systems have hidden rules that, you're aware of if you're in the system, but if you're outside the system, are completely invisible to you. And so, yeah, I applaud you in creating this platform where students who might not otherwise know those rules can start to untangle them and benefit from those experiences. So, I mean, you're building that now, and I guess the platform enables students to access some of these global programs and make decisions. And where do you see it growing from here in the future? Where do you see OneXplore going?
Yes, so when I think about the future growth of OneXplore, I think it in terms of its depth and also systems impact. Firstly, we want to deepen from the information access to the decision-making capacity. So far, OneXplore has already helped young people to see opportunities like scholarship and programs. And the next stage of growth, I would say, is helping them make sense of choices. And that means developing more structured learning products around the judgment and also long-term planning, not just only for applications. So in practice, I would say this looks like expanding the Action Lab and also the Pioneer program that we already had into a longer and also scaffolded experiences that help young people to understand why a path fits them, not just how to get in a practical way. The second thing I would say is growing as a trusted intermediary between global institutions and also Chinese youth. So OneXplore nowadays is increasingly position itself as a bridge because we already partnered with several universities, foundations, and international organizations to translate the global opportunities into the accessible, culturally legible formats. So in the future, I see OneXplore would play a stronger role as a localized partner for the global institution entering China and helping them to design the outreach, youth engagement, and also talent pipelines that are equitable. The third thing is to shift from stories as inspiration to some stories as infrastructure, because our over 1,000 real learning journeys, they are not just content. They are data about how young people really navigate the uncertainty in their personal and career life. A key direction for this growth is turning these narratives into structured insights and also mapping patterns of those barriers and informal capital. And this would, I think, ultimately allows OneXplore to inform the policy conversations around the education equity and access, not only for the individual choices. And finally, instead of becoming a generic global platform, I hope OneXplore's growth will be regional and relational. So we want to specifically build some strong nodes across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and even Europe through the Youth Ambassadors Program, peer networks, and also on-the-ground partnerships. So growth here would mean more perspectives, not a single dominant narrative of success for the youth. Yeah.
That's wonderful. It sounds like a lot of ambitious goals that will ultimately make a big difference for a lot of young people, which I think is great. And I think this, the whole notion of, international and global education and connectivity between students in China and the world, and also vice versa, I think is really important as we head further into the 21st century. So, yeah, I applaud everything that you're doing. And I thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast, and wish you luck with all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. It's really my huge pleasure to encourage more young people to be involved with the international and also diverse career and study paths. Thank you so much.
Fantastic.